The most dangerous mistake someone can make is assuming they already know everything about the person sitting across from them. Some people mistake quiet for weakness. Others mistake humility for a lack of ambition. My ex-wife made both mistakes. My name is Ethan Mercer. The morning everything truly began was Monday, March 18th, 2024. It was just after 7. Rain tapped lightly against the windows of our townhouse in Bellevue, Washington, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the kitchen. I was still wearing an old gray t-shirt from the day before, reading through a local business journal while my first cup cooled beside me. It looked like an ordinary weekday. For me, it was the day I finally understood exactly who I'd married. Vanessa was already dressed for work. Navy suit, silver earrings, perfect makeup, the same red lipstick she only wore when she expected to dominate a boardroom. She walked into the kitchen without looking at me and placed a thick envelope beside my coffee. "My attorneys finished it," she said while checking something on her phone. "It shouldn't take long." I looked at the envelope, heavy cream-colored paper, downtown Seattle, law firm's logo stamped neatly across the front. Everything about it looked expensive. "Prepared. Permanent. What is it?" I asked as she finally glanced up. "A postnuptial agreement." She said it as casually as someone mentioning they'd paid the electric bill. "I think it's time we organized things properly. We've been married for almost 2 years. Exactly. The longer we wait, the messier finances become." She smiled politely. It wasn't the smile I'd fallen in love with. That smile had disappeared months earlier. This one belonged to the CEO everyone admired and quietly feared. "Read it whenever you have time," she said. "If you have questions, my attorneys will explain everything." Then she picked up her laptop bag, grabbed her keys, and walked out the front door. She didn't kiss me goodbye. She hadn't done that in nearly 8 months. Not once. I knew because I'd noticed every single morning. The front door clicked shut. The house became completely silent. I stared at the envelope for several minutes before opening it. 11 pages. Every section carefully drafted. Every sentence designed to protect her future. By page 6, my financial status was described as limited, independently unverified, and presumed modest. That sentence almost made me laugh. Almost. Instead, something inside me became perfectly still, not angry, not emotional. Clear. Crystal clear. But to explain why that sentence mattered, I have to go back almost 4 years, because this story didn't really begin inside that kitchen. It began on a cool Thursday evening in October of 2020. The annual University of Washington Alumni Networking reception occupied the rooftop ballroom of a downtown hotel. Hundreds of successful professionals wandered from conversation to conversation, pretending they weren't there to impress each other. I had almost skipped the event. My longtime friend Michael Carter practically forced me to go. "You've been hiding since selling your company," he'd complained over dinner 2 nights earlier. "I'm enjoying retirement." "No, you're avoiding people." "That's different." "It isn't." He eventually wore me down. So there I stood with a club soda near the appetizer table, watching everyone exchange business cards like they were playing poker. I planned to stay 45 minutes, maybe an hour, then disappear. She found me before I found anyone else. "You're the only person here who doesn't seem desperate to impress somebody," a woman's voice said beside me. I turned. She was wearing a black cocktail dress and carrying herself with effortless confidence. Dark hair. Bright eyes. A smile that seemed completely genuine. At least that's what I believed then. "I could say the same about you," I answered. She laughed. Not politely, actually laughed. "I guess we're both failing at networking." She extended her hand. "Vanessa Cole, Ethan Mercer. What do you do, Ethan?" It was the question everyone asked. I'd learned years earlier that the shorter my answer, the easier my life became. I do some consulting, mostly retired. I invest here and there. She tilted her head. "Dabble, I suppose." Most people lost interest after that answer. Vanessa didn't. Instead, she asked what kind of books I liked, where I'd traveled, why. I preferred club soda over wine. We talked for almost 2 hours. She told me she was the chief executive. officer of North Point Freight Systems, a rapidly growing logistics company attracting serious investor attention. She was intelligent, funny, confident without appearing arrogant. She listened carefully. Whenever I spoke, or at least she appeared to, looking back now, I understand she wasn't listening because she cared. She was gathering information, building a profile. Learning exactly who she believed I was. Here's what Vanessa believed she discovered that night. A quiet former consultant, comfortable enough financially to retire early. Private. Modest. Predictable. Here single quotes s what she never discovered. 3 years before we met, I'd quietly sold the software company. I'd spent nearly a decade building to an international investment group headquartered in Boston. The sale changed my life forever. The number attached to the contract was large enough that even my financial advisors occasionally joked about it. I never announced it publicly. No interviews. No magazine features. No social media celebration. I signed the paperwork, went home, ordered takeout, watched a nature documentary. Then I woke up the next morning and continued, living almost exactly the same way I always had. Money attracts attention. Attention attracts expectations, and expectations attract problems. I'd learned very early that the quietest person in the room often hears everything everyone else misses. Vanessa thought she'd met a comfortable man living on investment income. She had absolutely no idea. She was speaking with someone whose business interests quietly stretched across industries she had never even considered. She never asked, and I never volunteered the answer. The weeks after that reception passed, almost effortlessly. Vanessa and I began seeing each other regularly. Some dates were elegant, others were as simple as grabbing coffee before walking along the waterfront while the sun disappeared behind the Olympic Mountains. She always seemed completely present. She remembered little details. My favorite restaurant. The fact that I hated unnecessary attention. The old jazz records my father used to play on Sunday mornings. At the time, I thought those things meant she genuinely cared. Looking back, I realized she was building a remarkably complete file on me without ever writing a single note. At least, that's what I believed. She invited me to charity galas, investor dinners, and company celebrations. I rarely enjoyed those events. Rooms full of executives competing to sound more important than the next person had never been my idea of a relaxing evening. Still, I went because she asked. Whenever she introduced me, the wording was almost identical. This is Ethan. He's retired now. He does a little consulting. He's wonderfully low maintenance. People smiled politely before steering the conversation back toward Vanessa and her company. I never minded being underestimated had served me well my entire adult life. One evening, about a month before our wedding, Michael pulled me aside during one of North Point's fundraising events. He watched Vanessa laughing with several board members before speaking. Can I ask you something? Of course. Have you noticed the way she introduces you? I shrugged. Not really. She always makes you sound harmless. I laughed. I don't need an impressive introduction. I'm serious. Michael lowered his voice. She talks about quarterly earnings with more excitement than she talks about you. I smiled. You're overthinking it. I hope so. He looked at Vanessa again. I really hope I'm wrong. I dismissed the conversation almost immediately. Love has a remarkable ability to explain away things that would otherwise seem obvious. We were married on a beautiful Saturday in June of 22. The ceremony overlooked Lake Washington. Only close family and a handful of friends attended. Vanessa insisted on keeping everything intimate. It should be about us, she said. I agreed. The simplicity appealed to me. Something did strike me as unusual. Though several of her company's largest investors sent extraordinarily expensive wedding gifts. Crystal. Artwork. Vintage wine. One even arranged a handwritten letter congratulating us on the partnership. At the time, I assumed they were simply generous. Years later, I understood they weren't celebrating romance. They were celebrating stability. Successful executive with a dependable husband. Projected confidence. Investors like confidence. The first year of marriage felt real. We traveled, cooked together, hosted friends, spent rainy weekends watching old movies from opposite ends of the couch while arguing over which one of us made better popcorn. If someone had asked me then whether I was happy, I wouldn't have hesitated. Absolutely. Without question. Then everything changed. It happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon in November of 22-3. Vanessa had gone into the office for what she called just a few hours. I stayed home to organize household insurance paperwork before year-end. We kept several shared folders for tax documents and property records. I wasn't searching through her private files. I simply clicked into the wrong archive directory while looking for homeowners insurance. One folder caught my attention. Its name was painfully ordinary. Archive. Inside sat a document with an even simpler title, Transition Strategy. At first I assumed it referred to North Point. I opened it without thinking. Within 30 seconds, my stomach tightened. It wasn't a business strategy. It was our marriage. 12 pages. Professionally formatted. Meticulously organized. The document outlined 5 years of objectives. Year 1. Establish public image. Year 2. Expand shared financial visibility. Year 3. Strengthen external perception of stability. Year 4. Prepare legal separation. Year 5. Finalize divorce while protecting primary assets. Every section read less like a marriage and more like a corporate acquisition plan. Then I reached page 7. One name appeared repeatedly, Ryan Holloway, North Point's Chief Operating Officer. I'd met him several times. Firm handshake. Perfect smile. Always called me my friend. The room suddenly felt much quieter. I closed the laptop. Walked into the kitchen. Opened the pantry. Without really thinking, I began making homemade pasta. Rolling dough by hand gave my mind something simple to focus on while everything else rearranged itself. Some people yell when their world falls apart. Others cry. I've always cooked. The rhythm keeps me steady. When dinner was ready, I set 2 plates on the table, opened a bottle of Washington Cabernet, lit a candle. Everything looked perfectly normal. Vanessa came home just after 8. Something smells amazing, she said with an easy smile. Fresh Casio e Pepe, my favorite. I know. We ate dinner together. She talked about meetings, shipping delays, investor expectations. I nodded in all the right places, asked thoughtful questions, refilled her wine, smiled exactly when a husband should smile. Later that night she fell asleep almost immediately. I lay awake staring into the darkness, not because I was deciding whether to leave. That decision would come much later. I stayed awake because one realization refused to leave me alone. I hadn't been chosen despite being quiet. I'd been chosen because I was quiet. No public profile. No interviews. No social media. No obvious fortune. No oversized ego. From her perspective, I was the perfect supporting character. Dependable. Invisible. Predictable. Exactly the husband a rising executive would want standing quietly beside her while investors evaluated her judgment. For the first time since meeting Vanessa, I understood something that hurt more than betrayal itself. I hadn't been loved. I'd been selected. Around 3 that morning, I finally made a decision. There would be no confrontation. No shouting. No dramatic accusations across the breakfast table. If she'd spent years building a strategy around me, I would simply build a better one, and I would do it so quietly that she wouldn't recognize it until every move had already been made. The next 4 months became an exercise in discipline. Every morning looked exactly the same from the outside. I made coffee before Vanessa came downstairs. I asked about her meetings. I remembered birthdays, anniversaries, and dinner reservations. If she watched me closely, she saw the same husband she'd always believed she understood. Inside, though, everything had changed. I wasn't pretending because I enjoyed it. I was pretending because I needed time. Time is the one advantage people willingly hand to someone they underestimate. On the first Monday after discovering that document, I made one phone call. There was only one person I trusted with something this complicated. Daniel Rhodes answered on the second ring. He'd been my attorney for nearly 15 years. We'd worked together through the sale of my software company, countless investments, and more contracts than either of us cared to remember. Ethan, he said, you never call this early unless somebody's getting sued. Not yet. A brief silence followed. How serious is it? I need you in Bellevue. When? As soon as possible. He didn't ask another question. I'll be there tomorrow. Daniel arrived the following afternoon carrying a legal pad, 2 coffees, and the calm expression of someone who never panicked because panic never solved anything. My office wasn't inside our townhouse. Vanessa believed I handled everything from the kitchen table. That misconception had been convenient for years. My actual office occupied a quiet corner of a small commercial building a few miles away. The company name on the door meant nothing to anyone outside my accountants. That was intentional. After Daniel sat down, I handed him a printed copy of the 12-page document I'd found. He read every page without interruption. When he finished, he leaned back and slowly removed his glasses. She documented the entire plan. Every page. He looked at me for a long moment. That's either breathtaking confidence or breathtaking arrogance. I've been thinking the same thing. What do you want to do? Instead of answering immediately, I slid another sheet of paper across the desk. It contained a short list I'd been refining for months. Daniel scanned it once, then again. His eyebrows rose slightly. You've already started planning. I started the night I found the file. You've been sitting on this for months? I wanted to make sure I wasn't reacting emotionally. A faint smile crossed his face. I've represented a lot of wealthy clients. Most of them would have exploded within 24 hours. I've never found explosions particularly useful. He nodded. No, I suppose you haven't. He closed the folder. All right, if we're doing this, we do it carefully. We don't bluff, we don't rush, we build. That single word stayed with me. Build. Not destroy. Not attack. Build. During the following weeks, Daniel established a new holding company. The paperwork was intentionally ordinary. The name was Cedar Summit Holdings. It sounded exactly like the kind of company nobody remembered 5 minutes after hearing it. Ordinary names disappear into ordinary paperwork. That's often their greatest strength. Our first move wasn't flashy. It wasn't even particularly exciting. Through multiple legal entities, Cedar Summit quietly began purchasing a minority position in North Point Freight Systems. Not enough to attract headlines, not enough to alarm investors, just enough to matter. The acquisitions were spread across several transactions over weeks instead of days. Each purchase looked routine on its own. Together, they formed something much more significant. By midsummer, I quietly controlled just over 11% of the company. Vanessa spent every waking hour trying to grow. She had absolutely no idea. That evening she cooked dinner. Halfway through the meal she smiled and said, "I'm lucky to have someone who never makes life complicated." I smiled back. So am I. Sometimes the hardest part of a long strategy isn't making difficult decisions. It's keeping your face completely ordinary while you're making them. Life settled into an almost surreal rhythm. Weekdays belonged to Vanessa's career. Weekends belonged to my planning. Saturday mornings, I drove downtown under the excuse of meeting investment advisors. That part wasn't even a lie. I simply never mentioned which investments. At home, nothing changed. We still walked through Bellevue Botanical Garden on quiet Sunday afternoons. We still ordered takeout from the same little Italian restaurant every other Friday. We still hosted neighbors for dinner once a month. Anyone watching us would have described our marriage as stable. Happy even. Only 2 people knew otherwise. One of them had written the plan, the other had discovered it. Some nights were harder than others. I'd be lying if I claimed I stopped loving her the moment I found that document. Feelings don't disappear because evidence appears. They fade slowly. Unevenly. Sometimes painfully. One rainy evening, I found myself standing alone in the kitchen after midnight with a glass of bourbon in my hand. I stared out the window for nearly 20 minutes. I never took a sip. I kept remembering the woman I believed I'd met 4 years earlier. The laughter, the conversations, the effortless chemistry. I wanted those memories to be genuine. Part of me still did. Eventually I poured the bourbon into the sink. The glass, turned off the kitchen light, and reminded myself that wanting something to be true doesn't make it true. The following morning I went back to work, not because revenge had become my purpose. Because clarity had. By early autumn another opportunity appeared. Vanessa often talked about North Point's largest transportation. Partners over dinner. She rarely noticed how much information she volunteered. One carrier struggled with cash flow. Another wanted outside investors before expanding into the Midwest. She saw operational challenges. I saw possibilities, working quietly through Cedar Summit. I invested in both companies, not controlling ownership, just enough to gain influence. When major contract negotiations arrived, months later, North Point would unknowingly negotiate multi-million-dollar agreements with businesses where I now occupied a seat at the table. No threats. No manipulation. Just preparation. Every move stayed completely within the law. Every document could withstand scrutiny. Daniel insisted on that. So did I. The goal was never to trap Vanessa. It was to ensure that if she insisted on treating our marriage like a business transaction, she would eventually discover she'd never been the only strategist sitting at the table. Winter arrived quietly in the Pacific Northwest. The mornings grew darker. Rain settled over Bellevue for days at a time, turning the streets into long ribbons of reflected lights. From the outside, our lives looked almost picture-perfect. Vanessa continued appearing in business magazines. North Point announced another successful quarter. Friends congratulated US on what they called a power marriage. I smiled every time someone said it, if only they knew. One Thursday morning in late January, Daniel called before sunrise. I found something, he said. His voice carried that calm excitement I'd learned to pay attention to. What is it, Ryan Holloway? I leaned back in my chair. Go on. He operates a private investment partnership outside his executive position. I waited. It isn't illegal. It just isn't widely known. How large? Small enough to stay under the radar, but large enough that he's looking for anchor investors before raising another fund. I looked out my office window. Rain drifted across the parking lot. Can we participate without exposing me? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Yes, but there need to be multiple layers between you and the investment. How many? I'd recommend 3. I smiled. Make it 4. He laughed quietly. I was hoping you'd say that. Within 2 months, Cedar Summit had quietly become one of the limited partners in Ryan's investment fund. Every legal document had been reviewed repeatedly. Every transaction complied with state and federal regulations. Every connection between Ryan and me disappeared behind several legitimate business entities. Ryan never knew, neither did Vanessa. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who had smiled across dinner tables and toasted our marriage had unknowingly accepted my capital. Life continued exactly as before. Vanessa still came home exhausted after board meetings. She still vented about investor expectations while I cooked dinner. She still thanked me for always keeping life simple. Sometimes I wondered whether she believed those words or whether she simply liked hearing herself say them. By the beginning of spring, everything Daniel and I had planned was finally in place. Every investment. Every document, every layer, every contingency. There was only one step left. Disclosure. Not to the public. To the attorneys. Are you certain? Daniel asked one afternoon as he placed a thick binder on my desk. I looked at it. 40-8 pages. It contained complete financial disclosures. Business interests, real estate holdings, investment, partnerships. Corporate ownership. Everything. This changes the conversation forever, Daniel said. I know. You won't be able to undo it. I don't want to. I opened the binder. Every page represented years of quiet work long before I'd ever met Vanessa. The software. Company. Commercial properties. Private equity positions. Technology startups. Renewable energy. Investments. Everything she'd assumed didn't exist. Everything she'd never bothered asking about. Send it, I said. 3 days later, Vanessa's attorney called Daniel. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. Afterward, Daniel phoned me. Well, he was surprised. That's one way to describe it. What did he say? Daniel smiled. He said your holdings were considerably more extensive than his client had represented. I imagine they were. He asked whether you'd like to renegotiate the postnuptial agreement. I shook my head even though he couldn't see me. No, you want to keep it exactly as she wrote it. Another pause. I have to admit, Daniel said. That's elegant. It isn't revenge? No, it's accountability. Several days passed before anything happened. Then something unusual occurred. Vanessa came home before 4 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon. That had never happened. She walked into the kitchen without removing her coat. No phone. No laptop. No hurried conversation about meetings. She simply stood there looking at me. Daniel sent the disclosures, she said quietly. He did? You own Cedar Summit? Yes. You own part of North Point. I do. Her eyes searched my face. For how long? I met her gaze without raising my voice. Since shortly after I found your strategy document. She didn't speak. The file, she finally whispered. The file. Silence filled the room. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows. Inside, neither of us moved. You read it. I did. You never said anything? I folded my arms. Neither did you? She looked down at the floor for several seconds before walking toward the window. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass. How much? She asked softly. How much what? How much do you actually own? It wasn't curiosity. It was calculation. The numbers she'd been relying on had just disappeared. Enough that your attorneys were asking the wrong questions. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. When she turned around, something had changed. For the first time since we'd met, the practiced executive mask was gone. She simply looked tired. What do you want, Ethan? It was an honest question. Maybe the first completely honest question she'd ever asked me. I considered it carefully. Months earlier, I would have answered differently. I would have said I wanted my marriage back. I would have wanted the woman I believed I'd fallen in love with. But that woman no longer existed. Or maybe she never had. I want exactly what you offered. She frowned. The agreement. Your agreement. Every word. She stared at me in disbelief. You aren't changing anything? No, you own part of my company. Yes, you invested in our suppliers. Yes, you even invested alongside Ryan. I did. She slowly shook her head. I never imagined. I know. She looked at me for a long time. Then, almost in a whisper, she said the one sentence that explained everything. I underestimated you? I nodded once. Yes, you did. Neither of us spoke again. She picked up her purse, walked to the front door, paused for only a moment. Then she left. The door closed softly behind her. I stood alone in the kitchen listening to the silence. Oddly enough, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like acceptance. Some stories don't end with celebration. They end with clarity. And sometimes clarity is enough. The legal process began the following week. There were no dramatic courtroom scenes. No shouting matches in crowded hallways. No reporters waiting outside with cameras. Everything unfolded inside conference rooms where people spoke calmly, reviewed documents, and occasionally sat in long stretches of silence. Daniel represented me. Vanessa's legal team represented her. Every meeting came back to the same unavoidable fact. The postnuptial agreement had been drafted almost entirely around the financial picture Vanessa believed existed. It protected the assets she had disclosed. It addressed the property she believed I owned. It reflected assumptions that had never been verified because she never thought they needed to be. The agreement hadn't failed because of a loophole. It failed because it had been built on an incomplete understanding of reality. Daniel summarized it perfectly after one particularly long meeting. Your client protected herself from the husband she imagined. She never prepared for the husband she actually married. No one argued with him. There wasn't much they could say. The disclosures were complete. Every investment had been properly documented. Every ownership interest had existed long before the agreement was drafted or had been acquired. Through lawful business transactions afterward, nothing had been hidden from the court. Nothing had been fabricated. The facts simply weren't what Vanessa had believed them to be. The divorce was finalized in early summer. When I moved out of the townhouse, I packed only what belonged to me. Books, family photographs, a few pieces of furniture. The old coffee mug I'd used almost every morning since college. Everything else stayed exactly where it had always been. Clean. Orderly. Final. A month later, I leased a condominium overlooking Lake Washington. The view wasn't dramatically different from my old home. The feeling was, for the first time in nearly 2 years, the silence inside my home belonged only to me. One afternoon, while sitting on the balcony with a cup of coffee, Daniel called again. "You might find this interesting." "I'm listening." "North Point's board has scheduled an emergency governance meeting." I wasn't surprised. Once my ownership position became public through the divorce filings, institutional investors naturally started asking questions. Not because I'd done anything improper, because uncertainty always attracts attention. What are they asking? Mostly about stability and leadership. Several weeks later, another call arrived. This one was different. The chairman of North Point's board requested a private meeting. Curiosity got the better of me. I accepted. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. No one mentioned my divorce until the very end. Instead, they asked about software development, corporate growth, risk management, long-term planning. They had done their homework. Unlike years earlier, someone had finally looked beyond the quiet exterior. As we concluded, one board member folded his hands. "Mr. Mercer, we've spent the last several weeks reviewing your business history. You've built companies. You've scaled operations. You've managed acquisitions. You understand logistics better than most people in this industry." I simply listened. "We'd like you to consider joining North Point's board." I thanked them for the confidence, then politely declined. The room grew quiet. "I appreciate the offer," I said. "But if I'm going to commit that much time, I'd only consider doing it as chairman." A few surprised expressions appeared around the table, not because the request was unreasonable, because I had delivered it so calmly. "We'll discuss it," one director replied. 3 weeks later, they called back. The vote had passed. I accepted. The press release generated modest attention within the business community. Nothing sensational. Just another executive appointment in a busy industry. Vanessa saw the announcement the same day everyone else did. We never discussed it. There wasn't anything left to say. Months passed. North Point stabilized. Several operational improvements I'd recommended began producing measurable results. The company regained investor confidence. Employees stopped worrying about leadership changes. Business returned to being exactly that. Business. One crisp autumn morning, I met Michael for breakfast at a small cafe overlooking the water. He arrived carrying the same sarcastic grin he'd worn for 20 years. I read the announcement. "I figured you would." He stirred his coffee before looking at me. "You know what I've been thinking?" "What's that?" "The night before your wedding, when I told you something felt off." I smiled. "You were right. I wish I hadn't been." "So, he watched the boats drift across the lake. So, what now?" I looked out at the water. For a long moment I didn't answer. The truth was surprisingly simple. I keep living. That's it. "That's it. No victory speech?" No celebration?" I smiled. "I've learned that peace is a better reward than revenge." He nodded slowly. "I like that answer. So do I." We finished breakfast talking about baseball, old college memories, and where we might travel the following summer. For the first time in years, the conversation had absolutely nothing to do with lawyers, business strategies, or betrayal. Life had finally become ordinary again. As I walked back toward my car, I realized something that hadn't occurred to me during the entire divorce. Winning had never been the point. Protecting my integrity was. Money can be rebuilt. Companies can be sold. Titles come and go. But your character is the one investment that follows you everywhere. Vanessa underestimated my finances. She underestimated my patience. Most of all, she underestimated the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are without needing anyone else to validate it. And in the end, that made all the difference. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves a great revenge story. And be sure to check out more videos here on the Revenge Hub.